demography, the changing society. We have, because Carlos from IMLS actually couldn't make it today, we actually have a panel comprised entirely of people whose first names start with J. I'm not sure what that says, but John Bertot, who is a professor at Maryland's iSchool and is co-director of the Information Policy and Access Center and one of the people behind the Symposium. We have Jonathan Lazar, who is from Towson University normally, but currently is on loan to Harvard and Radcliffe. And we have Dr. Joe Richardson, who is, or Joseph Richardson, excuse me, who is from the University of Maryland as well, an assistant professor in the African American Studies Department. For everybody who's on the panels who are using PowerPoint, I forgot to mention earlier, we have this nice clicker thing that lives here. The one that says Oxley, use that. And, okay. And you have to point down here if you're using it.
No, I think this is a Bluetooth.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, this presentation can load first.
I don't know what,
Yours is probably the most right over. Yeah.
All right.
So do you have this? It's okay.
Alright. My notes are up on the phone. It's just easier for me to do this way. I tend to pace, so, well, alright, Rebecca, I'm going to try not to pace.
Just stay near one microphone.
Alright, I'll do my best. Alright, thank you. So thanks again, and we are under time constraints, so I'll try and move relatively quickly through this. One of the things that I like to do is give an overview of how our demographics are changing in the U.S. And one of the things I like to say is that I'm starting with sort of aggregated data, right? And I'm not really looking at individual kinds of data sets per se, except in a couple of spots. So clearly some of the things will change depending on what community you decide to burrow down into when you start looking at some of the changes in census data and various other things. The other thing I want to say, just as a caveat, as I started, is Jonathan is going to cover in great depth persons with disabilities kinds of data, various other things. So I've left some of that off of my presentation so that we didn't duplicate, right? So I'm presenting sort of other different kinds of data sets. So with those caveats, there are basically three key trends that I want to point out. We're growing, we're getting older, especially those of us on stage. And we're more ethnically and racially diverse, right? And so a couple of things I'd like to do is go over some different data points that I think will be of interest to us, because I think it has huge implications for the types of services we design and provide in our libraries and schools and other community institutions. So growing. We've grown 103% since 1950. That's a fairly large and significant amount of growth. So we've gone from 152 million to 308 million people in that time frame. That's as compared to some other industrialized nations, right? Like Germany is at 21%, Italy is at 30%. And by the way, there are some nations that are actually in decline, like Japan, right? And if you read, statistics on growth in Japan, they are on the way out. In fact, there's a point in time at which Japan and Japanese culture may sort of cease to exist because they are actually declining in population at a relatively significant rate. If this continued growth continues, at this kind of rate, we anticipate being about 440 million people in the U.S. By 2050, right? So our trend line is up over a period of time. And in terms of gender, women are growing at a slightly higher rate than men, but that's sort of the breakdown in terms of the growth rate by gender. But more importantly as well, what we're starting to see, this only goes up through 2009, we continue to be a nation of immigrants, right? And what you're starting to see in terms of these is that the pace of growth has slowed somewhat, but we still continue to be bringing in people through immigration. And in fact, there's a couple different things. Primarily, the folks coming into the United States come from Mexico, China, Philippines, India, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Vietnam. Although I would suspect that will likely change over time, right? Depending on which individuals decide to immigrate into the United States. And the other issue is that about 62% of those people who come to the United States end up in certain regions of the country, right? So a fairly large amount are in California, New York, New Jersey, Texas, Florida, and Illinois as a result. And I think we saw some of the impacts of that certainly a few days ago. In terms of age, we are getting older. I mean, I think there's some interesting things in here when you look at some of the census data that I would like to point out. One is, yes, we are getting, the populations that are 65 and older, for example, are growing. But what's really sort of interesting in this mix as well is that the oldest of the oldest are growing, right? So what we're having is, as people live longer, we're having this much higher sort of trend growth in the sort of 75, 80, 85-year-olds. And I think that it has some really interesting implications for us as information professionals providing lifelong learning services, and also following on what Jill said, and I know what Jonathan will talk about momentarily. So the trend line for the growth in the elderly is fairly significant, as well as those in other populations as well. The other thing that I kind of put this up using some of the major demographic groups. One of the things that I find really interesting in this, in terms of the median age by race, is the Hispanic population tends to be younger. And I think that has really significant implications for us as public librarians, working with populations in terms of early literacy and various other things like that, but then also in schools, right? Because if you have that population coming in and being the dominant populations within schools and using public libraries, I think that gives us an interesting indication of where we might need to think about some services and resources. Moving into race, I separated out the major groups because Native Americans and others, it's a smaller trend line, and so as a result, you couldn't really see them as well on this graph. But generally speaking, I think we need to point out a couple things. Population, the white population is declining. Hispanic population is growing. The African American population is growing, and so is the Asian population. The other thing that I think is really interesting to point out, obviously we have lower but somewhat growth in Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders and American Indians and Native Americans, but the population of two or more races, and I think Sandra pointed this out somewhat in her speech last night, which was really interesting to listen to, particularly from a youth services perspective, is growing, right? And we can see that trend is growing as well. So the barrier, sort of the groupings are changing as well, right? It's not just within groups, but it's sort of the composition of groups is changing significantly. And this, I aggregated, I cheated a little bit, but I figured, who's going to call me out on data use, right? But so what I did was I took all the different population numbers, right, including more than one race, and aggregated those as compared to the white population. And here's what we see, right? By 2050, actually a little bit before that, by 2040, 45 or so, the two lines cross. And at that point, the white population will be in the minority, and we will have a majority minority nation when you look across the different groups. All right, this one is from Pew, which I think is kind of hard to see, I'm sorry, but I couldn't, and you can't even see the URL there on the bottom, it's that little fencing thing, sorry about that, but I got this one from Pew, and what it really does, thanks, what's really interesting about this one is they looked at the growth in the Hispanic population across the United States, and you can see that it's quite significant. Obviously it's predominant in California and Texas, Florida, and certainly various states in the Northeast, including New Jersey, Maryland, New York. And I'll come back to the Texas situation momentarily when I look at some of these things. But the one thing I want to point out, for those who look at population centers and study culture, and someone who's lived in Florida for the better part of 8 years, and certainly sees this in Montgomery County, we need to be cognizant of the fact that although we talk about a Hispanic block, it really is not a block, right? There are many, many cultures within the Hispanic populations. And we need to acknowledge that they come for looking for information and resources and services quite differently depending on where they may have originated. So the other thing is, this one is, by the way, this is the blue states. I mean, this is for most of the it's an election thing, right? But I'm not trying to do that. I'm really not trying to be partisan. But the reason why I put this up is because the Wall Street Journal did a really interesting thing a couple of days ago with an interactive map. And what they did was they gave different trend lines you could look at. And what they did was, one of the things you could look at was the states that became bluer, or the areas that became bluer since 2004. And what you should see here is, guess what? Pretty interesting, follows the growth in various populations, particularly the Hispanic population, right? So we are seeing how this is impacting policy and a range of other things as we move forward. And actually today, and of course it will continue moving forward. But it does a really nice job when you look at where the votes were in terms of looking at the trend line over that period of time. And that was since 2004. The other issue I want to point out, which I think is quite significant, is poverty. I think we need to acknowledge the fact that since 2006, poverty has grown rather significantly. We're at just over 15% in poverty as compared to about 12.3% in 2006. And that translates into about 46.2 million people living below the poverty line. So this is quite significant. And again, you can see some of the same, comparison points, right? California, Texas, various southern states, although that's blocking it out over there. And in some cases, it's quite significant. The deeper the red, the higher the poverty, and you're looking at over 17% poverty rate in those areas. So I want to conclude with a couple of things because I think that we need to be thinking about information services and serving the unserved sort of in the 21st century. And I want to start with a local example because this one's near and dear to my heart because I have 3 kids in Montgomery County schools. Is anybody from Montgomery County here? Yeah. Oh man, I'm going to get in trouble with this one, but that's okay. So my kids, one of the things that Montgomery County did years ago, which I thought was a really poor choice in labeling, this is before we moved here, they created sort of 2 zones in Montgomery County schools, green and red zone. Now, for those of you who believe language is important, when you think about the green zone, green is good, red is bad, right? I mean, so whoever came up with that label really, really needed to rethink that. But, if you want to look at some data, unfortunately, green and red kind of holds true with some of those things. So one of the things I did, I only picked a couple of data points. Graduation rate from the high schools that are sort of in the green zone, and there you're talking about high schools that are like Bethesda, Chevy Chase, Potomac, all the nice little zip codes that are in Montgomery County. And lo and behold, their graduation rate on average is about 94%. Whereas in the red zone, which is Silver Spring, Wheaton, Kennedy, all these other communities that have larger immigrant populations, more people in poverty and all that, 77%. So, and by the way, the state mandate is to be at 85% graduation rate. The schools in the red zone aren't even meeting the state mandated 85%. And in fact, in the high school that my kids go to, I shouldn't brag about this, but they've actually gone backwards. They were at 79% graduation rate 2 years ago, and now it's at 76%. There's clear issues. The other thing that since we're a testing society, one of the things that they do in the schools is based on test scores is look at how many students graduating are actually University of Maryland ready, right? How many of these kids would be able to get into the University of Maryland system. In the green zone, it's 77%. In the red zone, 61%. So clearly we have some really, on average, right? So we clearly have some issues of equity and opportunity across the different schools. Now another one, and unfortunately this one I know you can't see as well, but is, since we do a lot of work with telecommunications policy and access, we took, this is the Public Library Funding and Technology Access Survey data, and we mapped it according to the federal communications unserved areas in broadband. All right, and so what we did was we took all 16,500 libraries and mapped them. Those we had data for in terms of broadband. And one of the things that you will see, and I'll show this in better, sharper relief in the next slide, is that in a fair number of counties that the Federal Communications Commission considers unserved, those are the pink ones. We don't have broadband, there's no broadband access, and in some cases, libraries don't even have broadband access in those communities. So we're creating sort of this unserved of unserved, right? You can't get it at home, and you can't necessarily get it in the library. And here is, I thought what I tried to do is present a bit of a collage. And Herman, I'm not picking on Texas, where Herman might have gone. I'm sorry. But if you look at poverty data, right, here we are, very high poverty in Texas. If you look at broadband data, mostly unserved in those areas, and in many cases the libraries in those areas are unserved, and you look at where the population growth has been, particularly in terms of Hispanic populations, we're starting to see some really big trends overlaid on this that we need to really start addressing. And the final thing I'll say before turning it over to, I think, Jonathan will be now. I'm not sure who's going to be next. But is that we need to link this notion of access to the broader policy context in areas of telecommunications, information access, education, especially in the education space. The school librarians can play a key role in those areas. And you have to wonder, for example, in those areas, if you're looking at demographic data in your area, what can the public libraries do, knowing that the graduation rates and university-ready rates in those are on the low side, right? So, for example, what is the Wheaton branch of the Montgomery County Public Library doing? What is the Silver Spring branch, particularly the new one that's being built, going to do in conjunction with the schools and the larger context to provide opportunity, frankly, because what you're seeing here is an opportunity lost. We are leaving segments of the population behind, and this is something that we absolutely need to be mindful of and keep always be aware of the policy context and where we can insert ourselves into that dialogue. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you for your time, and I'll turn it, I think, I'm not sure, but is Jonathan going to do this?
Next.
All right,
Go next.
should I bring the clicker over to you?
I'll get it.
You come over here. I'll just leave it here.
Okay.
So thank you.
Right. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. How are you doing?
Good morning, Jonathan.
All right, good. So, as Paul mentioned, I'm a professor at Towson University, but this year I'm living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm at Harvard, although my baggage right now is actually in Buffalo, from what I hear, so we'll see how that works out. Anyway, let's just talk for a minute about sort of the demands that you're under at public libraries. Now, one of the things that, how many people, by the way, are here from public libraries? Okay, I knew there'd be a fair number of people from public libraries. So you already know this. You're under increased demands. You're under a lot of stress. Budgetary stress, certainly, but also an increased number of patrons. You're getting a lot more people coming in for a number of reasons. First of all, the economy. It's really fun to go to Barnes & Noble and buy a book and have a $5 latte, but when the economy's tough, it's much more fun to go to the public library and not pay anything and see, you've seen that. You have the patrons coming in like, oh my God, this is free. This is great. Why was I going to Barnes & Noble? Right? So you've got more patrons coming in to your public libraries. You get people coming in due to unemployment also. You get people coming in for help finding jobs, for help finding information, for help applying for benefits and things like that. One of the things over the summer I was involved with the LIS Gov project, building resources for public libraries to assist patrons with e-government. And I've worked with public librarians all the time before, and I'm always surprised though. Every time you kind of get back into being at the libraries and talking with people for weeks on end, you're reminded how much librarians play all these other roles like social workers and psychologists and therapists, and aside from all the things you've been trained to, you also wind up being sort of the community worker helping people when they come in and they say, I don't know where to turn, so I'm turning to you. It's amazing in my mind when you really sit down for weeks on end and talk to librarians, how much in this economy, how much public librarians are really serving the needs of the community. Oh, a light just went on. Okay, so apparently that somehow is symbolic of the fact that that's very true. When you talk about librarians, the sun comes out. Especially since there's so many cutbacks at government agencies and you can't get help, what happens? You have people coming into their libraries looking for help, right? And even I think in this time when everyone's kind of stressed out and now everyone's worried about the fiscal cliff and unemployment, people like libraries. Why? Because you come to the library and they're friendly people and you get to see your neighbors and you get to see children reading books. And it's a happy place to be. Despite all the budget cuts and all the things going on, libraries are still happy places to be. So you're seeing more and more people come into the libraries, especially due to cuts in government services, and you're also facing the budget cuts. And it's what Jill had mentioned earlier in her keynote also, that very often people with disabilities, they want to go to their public library. They don't want to go, I'll give you an example, there's, is this Pick on Texas Day? John had said? Okay, so in Texas, they don't have the services, I was blown away by this, they don't have the services that we have in Maryland with LBPH. Texas is basically call us or write to us, let us know what books you want, we've got a warehouse, we'll ship some books out to you if you have a print disability. Whereas in Maryland, we've got LBPH here that has, book clubs and drumming circles and poetry readings and all these other things. People with disabilities want that too. That's the stuff that people, the public, loves about your local library. So, as we move into this new digital era, there are lots of opportunities for libraries to better serve people with print disabilities. But what's funny is I was talking with Jill before, and Jill's telling me a little bit about what she's going to say in her keynote, and I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I'm going to say. So let me first of all say I agree with Jill. One of the key changes, though, is that it used to just be LBPH that would help patrons with disabilities, and the local library would say, oh, go to that library. But guess what? Since so many more of the resources are now digital, since we're talking websites, digital libraries, ebooks, guess what? Your local library can now provide services better to patrons with different types of disabilities, especially print disabilities. So really, it's a situation very similar to what's going on university campuses. It used to be years ago, you had the Disability Student Services Office, and anytime you had a student with disability, you just send them there. Right? Well, what happens is on university campuses now, as we're getting learning management systems like Blackboard, as we're putting many more lectures online, do lecture capture, it doesn't work anymore to say, oh, go to Disability Student Services, they'll help you. What do you need to do? You need to get involved, the CIO, you need to get involved, the IT division, to make sure that these purchasing decisions, that these software development decisions really are done in an accessible manner so that they can serve students with disabilities. So it's really the same thing. Now that you're purchasing all these digital resources in public libraries, you have the ability at your public library to serve patrons with print disabilities. And let me say the ability, that doesn't mean it's being done well yet. And that's really why there are a number of lawsuits and legal actions and things like that. But remember, digital material is inherently accessible. It's zeros and ones. It can be processed into multiple formats. Only developers put in the roadblocks, put in the barriers. Digital information is inherently accessible, and I want to talk about 3 areas: websites, digital databases, and ebooks. And by the way, if you think, oh, well, I've only heard 1 or 2 people saying this, Jill mentioned it, Jonathan mentioned it, I've heard it in one of my classes, I heard it. Guess what? There are a number of reports. Who is the person who mentioned the ARL report? Where are they? Yeah. So, he mentioned a few minutes ago that a report came out November 2nd from the Association of Research Libraries on serving patrons with print disabilities in research libraries. There's a somewhat similar report that came out from the AIM Commission. Raise your hand if you know what the AIM Commission, AIM, means. Raise your hand who knows what it means.
Sorry.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, it was a commission that was put together related to accessible instruction materials for higher education. It was a congressional committee that they put together with representation from a lot of different disability groups. The 2 reports, if you want to know more about this, and if you want to say, okay, this is great, how do we better serve people with print disabilities? The 2 most detailed reports are actually the ARL report, again, search on Report of the ARL Joint Task Force on Services to Patrons with Disabilities, that came out last week. And there was this AIM report. If you go to the U.S. Department of Education, Accessible Instructional Materials, AIM. That report came out last December, and it had a number of recommendations also. Now, the idea, even though neither one of these reports are 100% geared towards public libraries, they give you the background reading you need to know about how your public library, and certainly university libraries, how you can move forward to better serve people with print disabilities, whether it's students, whether it's a university library, whether it's a separate research library, whether it's a public library. What's happening is that there's this great opportunity to better serve people with disabilities. And there are a number of ways you can do this. How many people are familiar with the actions that have been taken recently from the Justice Department related to accessible ebook readers? Show hands. Okay, it looks like about half the room. Oddly enough, this side of the room, not that side of the room. I'm not sure why. That's sort of one of those. I'm sorry? Paul, this is which side?
The accessible side.
This must be the accessible side. Okay. So there have been a lot of actions in the last 4 years, and guess what? Because Obama was just re-elected and most of the team at the Justice Department is going to be in place the next 4 years, you're going to see these actions continue. So anyone here from Montgomery County Public Library? Okay, if I remember right, from Montgomery County, as part of the recent ADA settlement, they had to make their library websites and materials more accessible for people with disabilities, right? It's part of the Justice Department settlement, right? So there you go. It could happen to you. Start planning, start thinking about it. Now, there are really 3 things to think about, or at least 3 general things to start thinking about. Ebook readers, digital libraries and databases, and your websites. There have been a number of legal settlements recently related to ebooks. Jill Lewis mentioned this. If you look at Sacramento, if you look at Philadelphia, if you look at the public libraries, where basically they purchased ebooks that were not accessible to print-disabled users, and all these users said, wait a minute, you're buying electronic books. This could be accessible to us. We could use your services under the ADA. We have the right to use your services. Why can't we do that? There have also been very similar agreements in the higher education realm related to a number of universities. So what you want to do is make sure that you're focused on accessible ebooks, and actually there's a great description in this ARL report about what makes an ebook accessible. You've really got 3 different issues. You've got the physical device itself. If it's 100% touchscreen with no alternatives, that could be problematic. They talk about the application, and then they talk about the e-reader content, the actual book itself. And remember, it's not always what you would immediately think, because people say, oh, iPad, touchscreen, not accessible. Actually, iPads have tons of accessibility features. So they actually work really well. So spend time getting to know these ebooks, these readers. Out of curiosity, how many people know what a VPAT is? VPAT, raise your hand if you know what a VPAT is. Okay, we've got like 4 people. Yes. A VPAT is basically a documentation it's called a Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, and it documents the accessibility features in a product. So when you call a company, say, hey, can we see your VPAT? And when they say what? Say, sorry, we can't play with you. If you don't even know what it is, if you can't tell us about accessibility, sorry, we can't do business. That's how it works. I mean, if you look at what's happened with higher education, it's universities saying, sorry, we can't purchase that product because it's not accessible. So the first place to start is with ebooks. Remember, librarians have a lot of purchasing power. Public libraries have a lot of purchasing power. That's the way that you enforce this. You say, sorry, we are under legal requirements to do X, Y, and Z. We cannot purchase ebooks from you. We cannot purchase this content. And that's that same approach you want to take when it comes to access to digital libraries. Very often, public libraries are paying for access to, all sorts of databases, access to journals online, things like that. Guess what? It's a great opportunity the next time you do your procurement. Right? And remember, this is DC. People love procurement. This is not... you know what I mean. Right? We had this radio show about accessible technology on Kojo Namdi, and they kept getting calls about procurement questions. Well, what if I use Form 5986 and we found an FJ6, and I'm sitting there like, I don't even know what they're talking about. So it's DC. We have lots of people who have expertise in procurement. Well, guess what? Procurement is the key to making sure that you acquire accessible digital library content, accessible digital databases. Because once you've done the contract, your public library can't go in and change the content. You cannot be responsible for marking it up properly. You need to put in those procurement contracts about accessibility, and not only say it must be accessible, but say how they have to meet that, how they have to document it, how you're going to check. Every 6 months we're going to have patrons with disabilities check. Every 3 months we're going to do some type of automated test. Right? Be very specific. Procurement is the key to making sure that you acquire, and remember, public libraries, right? You have a lot of purchasing power. You have to make sure that accessibility is enforced through procurement. So whether we're talking about digital content and journals, whether we're talking about ebooks, or whether we're talking about library websites. Now, library websites, you're on your own with that, right? You've got to work with your own staffs. Unless you have an outside firm build your websites, you need to follow accessibility standards. You can pull out your tomatoes to throw at me now, because in 2011, my students and I did a report, and we found in 2011, none of the public library homepages in Maryland actually were fully accessible and in compliance with Maryland state law, or with the ADA. None of them. How many people had already heard that? Wow. How many people had not heard that? Yeah, as I said, pull out your tomatoes, you can throw them at me. But the reality is that it's law. It's Americans with Disabilities Act. Libraries are listed as a public accommodation. The courts have already said that the ADA applies to public accommodations. In fact, as of the Netflix ruling earlier this year, how many people heard of the Netflix ruling? Again, it's this side of the room. Wow. Wow. Can I make a suggestion? You all need to mingle more. During when there's a lunch break, you all need to switch seats and move around. You know? So there was a judge's ruling earlier this year that even if you do not have a physical place, you're still covered under the ADA. So Netflix is actually covered even though there's no physical Netflix store. But since you're public libraries, guess what? You're definitely covered. Libraries, anyone here from research libraries, university libraries? Show of hands. Okay, of course you're covered, because you're covered as well under ADA, you're covered under Section 504. Basically, libraries are covered multiple ways. There's a Maryland state law that you're covered under. It's so legally clear that libraries are covered. So the question is, how are you going to move forward on that to make sure that your library websites are accessible? Right? And the key is engage patrons with disabilities. Ask them, right? Encourage them. Maybe set up every month you have a meeting where, kind of like the committee Jill was talking about, and say, how's our website doing? Do you have any problems? Do you have any suggestions? Of course, make sure it's a diverse group of people, right? Make sure that it's not just one disability that you always go to ask. But this is doable. This is possible, right? You have the power. Public libraries have the power through your purchasing to impact ebooks, to impact digital libraries, to impact all these companies who say either, oh, we can't do that, or they say, oh, of course we're accessible. Sure, and you ask, well, how do you know you're accessible? Well, we didn't get any complaints. Well, that's not how you know you're accessible. You know, I haven't gotten a speeding ticket recently. That doesn't mean I haven't sped. So hopefully no one's writing that down. The idea is that this is doable, because really people with disabilities can now be served with digital content in your local public library. Is there still going to be a role for LBPH? Of course, right? Because every public library isn't going to have a wide selection of Braille books and, lots of things like that. However, think about it. If the library is lending CDs and DVDs, right? People with disabilities can use those. Movies have closed captioning, right? Movies have video description. So a lot of the resources you have may already be accessible. You just need to find ways through your online catalog to make sure that people with disabilities can access this information. So the policy environment is moving in this direction. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department has been taking action. They've been enforcing the ADA more. As this regulatory process related to website guidelines for the ADA moves forward, they're going to start enforcing even more than they're doing now. Right? It's doable. My understanding is that public libraries in the state of Maryland, in fact, are right now putting together plans for how to improve their website accessibility. Anyone here from a public library who's working on that plan? All right, we've got 3 hands. This is great. And they're all sort of towards the middle of the room this time, so this is really good. Again, during lunchtime, please switch around. This is all doable. It's all possible. The local public library, the library that we all love, right, can better serve patrons with disabilities. And guess what? As more budget cuts are coming, as you've got this whole craziness with the fiscal cliff, the more allies you can have in your local public library to help justify why your library is awesome, to help justify why the needs are there. Jill can tell you, when she has to go to Annapolis, there are tons of patrons who come out and will say, LBPH is awesome. I love it. It's wonderful. Guess what? You could get some of those same people working on your team to go advocate for why you need more funding, to go advocate for why the public library is awesome. And public libraries are awesome, right? And you know what? People with disabilities want access to some of that awesomeness. So just please remember those three things. You want to improve access to ebook readers, digital databases, and make sure that your websites are accessible. And if you want to read more about this, the best two reports are both online. They're free. Oh, and by the way, they're in accessible format. Right? It is the recent ARL Joint Task Force and the accessible instructional materials report coming from the Department of Education. You can go to their website. So there's more information coming out there. There are more reports. There's more enforcement coming down the line. Again, the folks in Montgomery County know that already from the public library, so there's more enforcement. This is doable. Public libraries need to make sure they're serving more of the public. They're not libraries for people without disabilities, they're public libraries, right? And I'm so thrilled to be a part of this program today. And I'm so thrilled to be a part of the track in the master's program here at the University of Maryland. Because where do we start, right? You start with the students. You get them out there. You get them pumped up and excited about, oh, we can do this, we can do that. We can make a difference. We can make the quality of life better. I love libraries. Everyone deserves. In fact, you even see that I wore my book tie today to express my love of libraries. Right? Everyone deserves access to them, and so whatever we can do to improve access. By again, we're talking electronic access here, where you can make sure it's accessible. Procurement. If you don't know much about procurement, learn more about procurement. It's actually quite powerful. You know why? You can say all you want about, oh, we love people with disabilities, until the budgets actually lead to that same conclusion, until you use your budgetary power to make sure you're only acquiring accessible information. How much do you really love it? Right? It's like saying, we love our sports team, but we're going to cut it due to budget cutbacks. That's what we're doing at Towson right now, by the way.
Baseball.
So, I'm sorry?
The baseball team.
All right, we've got the sports side of the room apparently over here. This is the Towson side of the room. Yeah, so you know this, right? We're going through this discussion. Use your budgetary power to help improve the quality of lives for people with disabilities. I thank you, and I look forward to chatting with you the rest of today.
No, I'm going to speak. Good morning.
Good morning.
So, my name is Joseph Richardson. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Maryland in the Department of African American Studies. And I want to talk really informally today about how my research and the work I do connects to libraries, because I think it's really important. Since 2006, I have been the faculty advisor for the Black Male Initiative program, which is here at the University of Maryland. It's a program designed to improve the retention rates among African American male undergraduate students. When I started in 2006, our retention rate among black males was 28%. As of 2012, we've managed to increase it to 62%. We've managed to do that. We've managed to do that by actually utilizing the library services, particularly through study groups in the library, where we have students who are upperclassmen, whether they're juniors or seniors, who lead the study groups with incoming freshmen and sophomores. One of the things that has been really instrumental in helping to improve the academic retention of our students is we've established a database of classes where students have used their notes from previous classes as well as their tests, and established a data bank of notes and tests that they've previously taken, and use those and photocopy them so students could use those as study tools. But one of the things that has really been important has been our community outreach component. My research focuses on young men who are incarcerated primarily in adult jails. So I work with young adolescents who are between the ages of 15 and 17 who are incarcerated in adult jails in the District of Columbia as well as in Prince George's County Jail. For those of you who don't know much about youth who are incarcerated in adult jails, on any given day, 7,500 kids under the age of 18 are incarcerated in adult jails in the United States. Over 200,000 youth under the age of 18 every year are waived to adult criminal court. What my program, the intention and aim of my program is to pair University of Maryland black male students with young men who are incarcerated in detention facilities in this metropolitan area. We work with a population of kids who have a reading average anywhere between the 4th and 8th grade. And 4th grade reading levels are often predictive of school dropout, and school dropout is predictive of the trajectory of going into the criminal justice system. So what we try to do, and our program is called the Prison to College Pipeline Program. What we try to do is expose young people who are detained in detention facilities to college campuses, as well as to libraries in the local community. Because often we work with adolescents who are on the verge of dropping out of school, many of whom have never been on a college campus, never have been in the library in a local community. So what we do is we try to, once the young men in the facilities are released, we actually pair black male students from the University of Maryland to serve as mentors while they're incarcerated, and they bring all kinds of educational and cultural and social curriculum to the facilities to teach them on Saturdays. And then once they're released, we try to pair them up in the community to facilitate a successful reentry so they can easily integrate back into schools, which is often very difficult for kids who have been incarcerated, primarily because they've lost so much time in the educational system while they've been incarcerated. And that is specifically crucial for kids who have been incarcerated in adult jails, because youth who are incarcerated in adult jails receive absolutely no educational services. So they have no access to the library, no access to books, and it's the duty of our students as well as myself to provide some kind of substantial and sustainable curriculum for those kids to provide the bridge to educational success once they return to the communities in Prince George's County and Washington, D.C. Well, part of that process is our students either bring those kids up to the university, which has not been that successful up to this point, or they meet them in local libraries to study. And the aim and the goal of that is to get kids accustomed, one, to coming to college campuses, even if they don't plan to attend the University of Maryland, to actually be exposed to what it's like to be on a college campus. Unfortunately, I recently read an article yesterday in the New York Times which was discussing the affirmative action case in Texas. And there was some really interesting data regarding the lack of social economic diversity on college campuses. So although we have racial diversity on college campuses, the majority of people, even by race, who, even if they're African American or Latino or Asian, who attend colleges are typically from middle class or affluent families. There's not much social economic diversity on college campuses. So what we try to do is expose kids who have never been on a college campus and if they were never exposed to the mentors who we have, may not have the likelihood of coming up to this campus, but also engaging them in the culture of a college campus, whether it's socially or academically, so that we can provide an incentive for them not only to attend probably the University of Maryland, but also to gain interest in attending other schools in the local area. But I think more importantly, for the adolescents that we work with, is that libraries provide a safe space. Many of the young children that we work with, and I don't want to call them young men, but many of the children that we work with live in communities where they're exposed to violence constantly. We have adolescents who are suffering from symptoms of PTSD, from chronic exposure to violence. We have kids who are emotionally numb to experience violence. So libraries often become a safe space in communities as well as on this college campus. And we need to create and encourage librarians and those who work in libraries to create even safer spaces, because often they become a refuge for kids who live in those communities. And how can we begin to do that? Well, I guess that's the million-dollar question. And those are things that we need to think about as we sit here today and as this conference moves on, is how can we create creative ideas to connect disadvantaged youth who live in distressed communities where libraries are often subject to closure, I'm from the city of Philadelphia, and we're under enormous budget cuts. And I know that the Mayor Nutter has closed numerous recreational facilities, as well as libraries, which some are in my local community. So when we think about spaces where kids can feel safe, and we have a lack of recreational facilities and libraries, the onus even becomes that much more important for how we can create safe spaces to connect these kids, not only to library services, but to increase the likelihood that they'll remain in school and improve their reading levels. So I don't want to belabor the point of talking too much about my work. I think that we're here to really think about creative ideas of how we can do that and how we can create more resources to improve the life chances of the young men who are out there, who really are looking for a way to move social mobility, to move out of their current predicament into safer spaces on college campuses and complete high school, but often don't have the means to do it. And I think if libraries were created safe spaces where those young men and women felt more accepted in those spaces and could utilize those spaces, we would probably see more of them succeeding and more of them graduating from high school and moving on to college. So I just want to say that I honestly believe, and for myself, even growing up in Philadelphia as a young man, that libraries really were important for me. I can clearly recall I attended a high school of engineering and science, which was located on Temple University's campus. It's probably one of the only high schools in the city of Philadelphia which was on a college campus. And we used, as ninth graders, freshmen, we used the college library routinely. And it was my first exposure, literally, to college. And through that process of being on a college campus and using the college library for over a 4-year period was unbelievably a significant contributor to me wanting to go to college and feeling very comfortable using the library once I got onto a college campus at the University of Virginia. So I just want to say that I think we're here to create creative ideas about how we can create these spaces for young people, and I look forward to hearing some of your responses and comments. Thank you.
Plenty of time
We
for
have time?
questions.
Okay, we do, because I think it's at 9:30 we end. So are there any comments or questions people? Sarah?
Just like to respond to your comments. So, and I'm going to talk about my work a little bit. I'm Cassandra D. Tassel from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we just held a summit in June where we brought together 65 people from different stakeholder groups in the United States to talk about how public and school libraries could close the achievement gap for African American males.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually put out a report that is on a website called Bridge to Lit. It's Bridge, BRIDGETOLIT. And so we have some concrete ideas here for things that public and school libraries can do. And we actually had a group of young men from North Carolina Central University who were part of their Black Male Initiative, their Centennial Scholars Program. And it's just great work that you do. And I really am very passionate about and also agree with you that public and school libraries have a huge role to play in closing this gap, and continue to do research in those areas and invite other people to be part of that as well. But this report is available for free on the website, and there are lots of other resources there as well. So thank you for what you do.
So in the neighborhood where I grew up, my public library was moved from a Carnegie building to a space on the that is above a liquor store, into a small little room above a liquor store. And of course, it's a predominantly Black, under-resourced area. And I'm here, and they're there. What can I do?
It's a tough question.
First of all, who does that? But
So your library is now above.
a liquor store.
Wow.
It was in a beautiful Carnegie building, and resources were cut. but they built this new kind of strip mall thing. And the first floor is a liquor store, and the second floor is where the library was moved.
Right, so I guess based on the work that I've been doing, and this is the reason why I think connecting young people to college campuses is so important, is how can we either improve the libraries that are within schools, so libraries that exist within schools even become much more resource heavy in a sense. I don't necessarily know how I would address the issue of the library being above a liquor store, except for advocating to my local council person for why that we should have a change with that. But I definitely believe that advocating for better resources within the schools, because in my research that I've conducted in the past, and I've conducted research in several inner city schools, the libraries have been horrendous. I think we really want to start with I think if we really need to have a conversation about where we should begin, is how the state of libraries within public schools. Because we can have terrible libraries in the communities, but if we have really horrendous libraries within the schools, so I don't know if I answered your question. I think it's a great question, and I just don't have all the answers.
As you are working through, does the value of life itself become an important concept to the students you working with? To me, there seems to be an issue of life itself being valued.
Right.
And how do you stress that, or is it brought out? It becomes much more important than the library question.
Right.
So how do you bridge that gap, or make it important for these young men to accept that life is important and that there should be some goals established?
I think one of the ways is there's a quote which many researchers use who are ethnographers, and ethnographers, we kind of immerse ourselves in the lives of young people and we do research and write notes about them. But you have to meet young people where they are. Mm-hmm. And I believe that it's important to listen to the things that they want to read and they want to see, at least through the multimedia, and then have a way to be able to connect those materials to their own lives. So initially I made the mistake when I started working with some of my kids, kind of imposing what I thought we should be reading, mm-hmm. right? And I clearly remember this was a couple of years ago. One of the kids in my group came to me, and I guess this was his way of expressing that he really didn't know how to read too well. But he said to me, "Listen, I'm really not too much into books, but I would appreciate if you could bring in some films." Right? So that started igniting, and I allowed them, empowered them to kind of decide, well, which films would you like to see? And so we started thinking about some documentaries. I offered them some alternatives, and then we used the documentaries, and we also even used The Wire. And I don't know how many people are a fan of Wire, but I think it's the best show ever. But we use The Wire as well as a visual tool. And so using visual tools was a way that we kind of use those tools to frame violence and to frame how they perceive their own lives, and then you open that to a larger discussion about things. So I think meeting kids where they are, because often when you come into situations where you're dealing with kids who are incarcerated, you don't know where they are when they're reading. So you have to figure out really creative and innovative ways to get that discussion going, and kind of trying to frame that discussion around life chances and life opportunities and how they perceive them and how we can use those tools to engage them in that discussion.
Thank you. We have a question from Twitter. EJJ207 writes, "What can libraries do considering the poverty and low broadband availability in certain communities?" I guess that'd be for you, Dr. Bertot.
Well, actually, so yeah, well, there's a few different things. So one of the things that certainly happened at the federal level was, in part of the Recovery Act, was included sort of a broadband stimulus funds, if you will, about $4.2 billion or so through broadband technology opportunity grants, and then about another $2.5 6.7 or so, someone check my math, that went to the rural services. I mean, those were actually loans, not just, you know, flat out grants. And so I think that was clearly one of them. But the reality is that I think we need to go to going to councilmen and other people in your area. If you're not, if your community does not have access to adequate broadband, you're not going to be able to use these digital technologies, right? I mean, increasingly content is embedded within digital technologies that require ever-increasing amounts of broadband capacity. And so there is a need that's why I concluded with looking at the policy context. And actually, Jonathan did too, in a way, when we talk about sort of looking at the Justice Department and things. You know, we need to pay attention to this. We also need to pressure the telcos, right? I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach. Telecommunication carriers literally do redline. I mean, let's just be candid, right? They pick and choose where they're going to implement their networks, and they go for the more populated areas that will give them a greater investment on you know, their return on their investment. That has left rural communities, sometimes high poverty areas, out of the loop entirely, and so there's pressure that needs to be put on them. And the pressure that also needs to be put on them is to get them to back off when municipalities basically say, we're going to create municipal networks because you're not coming into our communities. They have fought that tooth and nail. And if they're not going to do it, then I think we have to basically step up to the plate and say, no, that's unacceptable. We're going to create our own networks. You also need to connect to the larger policy groups like schools, libraries, and Heller Shelby, as it's called, and they have an initiative of connecting libraries and getting them fiber to the library, and working through that way as well. And also pay attention to things like the E-rate services, right? Because they can provide you with discounts to that kind of connectivity. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach that we need to be cognizant of. Part of it is the policy context, but then it also is, you know, it behooves us to advocate for having that kind of access within our communities. I mean, I ended with that last slide to overlay those communities on purpose. We are creating truly a divide amongst who has access and who doesn't, and that simply does not allow for opportunity to all individuals to be able to access these kinds of content. It's not just an issue of persons with disabilities. It's an issue of just opportunity. The last thing, you know, when you talk about the school libraries, tying that, you know, even within well-resourced schools and communities, we have this issue. Right? I mean, it's not. I think we need to not just look at the poverty issue, but we also need to look at that broader context. In Montgomery County, for example, you know, connectivity is relatively low, although it's on the increase. And school libraries have been cut. You know, in my schools, for example, my kids have access to school floaters, basically, right? You know, they're there a couple days a week. And then, you know, they kind of rotate around to 2 or 3 different schools depending on their load. I mean, so it's not just an issue of poverty, and I think we need to be aware of that. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. I don't know who's calling people. Hey, go ahead.
So if we're talking about school libraries as providing that critical level of access for kids, which is something I'm very passionate about, how do we address the questions of SIPA and those students who only have access to information through the library, but are blocked from accessing anything that's on YouTube, regardless of the content, any blog, any wiki of any kind? That's a whole nother level of a digital divide.
Yeah, I'm not sure the best person. Well, it is, because, but, you know, but on the other hand, I gotta tell you, it's really funny. I mean, I feel like, okay, so, yes, I mean, for those of you who don't know, Children Internet Protection Act, I mean, just in case. And, you know, it was upheld, you know, it was passed, you know, well over, you know, a couple decades ago, and schools and libraries, public libraries that accept federal funds are required to filter content, right? But unfortunately, it's not just content that they've been filtering, they've actually been filtering out services, right? Especially social media. And it is a huge issue. I will tell you though, many teachers in my kids' schools actually set up their pages outside school and say, here's the stuff, you know, go here. And they probably are skirting a whole bunch of issues, right, by doing that. And so I don't want to call them out specifically. But it's a huge issue. And that, I think, is something that needs, again, at the policy level, working with the school districts. You know, these kinds of policies that are implemented with a sledgehammer, you know, that are really unfortunate, and they do in fact impede access to certain kinds of content. So, you know, I don't know if you have Jenny?
Yeah.
A long time ago, it's a very long time ago now, I worked in a poor school on the edge of, in London, teaching science, where there were a lot of children from immigrant families. And it became very clear that those kids were, many of them were phenomenally able. But how they differed from some of the other children was their expectations of what to expect in life and what they could achieve. So my question is really to do with whether and how successful we have been around this area and in the country in what I would call informal mentoring. And what I mean by that is that I also worked at UMBC for a while, and President Rabowski was a well-known African-American president who's written a lot about supporting African-American men in academic careers. Was well known for bringing in people who would basically sort of follow him around to learn what it was like to be a senior administrator in a research university. Now, I wonder if that happens a lot at the school level. And I'm not talking about formal internships. I'm talking about experiences that allow kids to basically be around others, to see what it would be like to be a teacher, to be a professor. It's not the same as an internship at all. It's a sort of more informal thing. Does much of that happen, and how successful is it?
I can only speak to Montgomery County schools, and I'd love to hear some of your comments on this. Montgomery County schools have set up academies within various high schools, as an example, where they have partnerships with Lockheed Martin and various others for sort of academies in engineering or environmental science and various other things, and they do try and bring some of that to the schools. But the comment you made about expectations, I think, is absolutely critical. Because there's a sense in some of these communities. I mean, actually, Wheaton is about to change over to a whole a group-based approach to education, which I'm really interested to see how that's going to work. But there is some of that is being tried, and they try and bring in people from the outside. But I think it also comes down to what happens in the home as well, and what levels are being set there. But if it's not being set at home, then how does the school come into that community? I'd love to hear some of your comments on that.
One of the models that we have tried or we have used, and I recently found out that it was actually a model which has been implemented for a while, is there's an AIM model, which is called Aftercare and Indiana Mentoring, which has been used to pair college students with incarcerated youth to close the achievement gap. And so one of the important aspects of our program for Prisoner College Pipeline is to have some of the kids that we work with actually shadow college students as they attend their classes, as they go to Stamp Student Union, and what it's like to be on a college campus. But we've also utilized our students as well as our staff to mentor kids at Greenbelt Elementary. And just to give you an idea of how effective it's been, and this article was written in the Washington Post on the success of our program mentoring at-risk African-American boys who are in elementary school there. When we started working with a group of 20 at-risk students, collectively they had 67 suspensions collectively among the group. By the end of the year, we had reduced the suspensions among that group by half. Wow. So literally, and I've mentioned several other statistics where we've managed to either improve the retention rates or reduce suspension rates. It's clear through our work and through the research that I've read that mentoring works, right? But I think one of the things that's really problematic, and this is my own perspective, so I don't want anyone to take this out of context, but I often believe too that mentoring should not be a one-on-one process. that mentoring, and I think the way that we've approached it thus far is to have a one-on-one relationship. I think kids could really benefit from teams of mentors. So I think mentoring should be, we should have groups similar to a family, right? Where we can have 3 or 4 people, and it could be intergenerational. It could be older people, younger people, people of different races, people from different occupations, but one of the things that we need to change the paradigm of mentoring is the idea that it necessarily has to be one-on-one. And I think if we had more creative ideas about mentoring and how we could facilitate that, probably have more successes in the outcomes of some of the young people that you've mentioned.
What's our time?
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Okay, well then Irene after.
Hi, I'm Irene Padilla. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Libraries for the Department of Education. I just wanted to mention that our Division of Career and College Readiness has been working with every community, so every county school system to put in place career programs. Okay, so I can't even remember what they called it before, but now it's more like a pet ed rather than what people who weren't the right way to. And they have been working with both school and public libraries to publicize this and to help assist them with the program. So now, whether kids know about this, whether they're reaching out to the majority of students who might not know what they're capable of, I don't know, but that is out there.
Actually, Irene, while you're standing, you're actually leading the effort within you're taking the leadership role within public libraries to make sure they improve their websites as well. So if you want, you can mention that for a minute. She's being shy, but she's actually working on that.
Well, you brought to our attention a year or 2 ago, maybe it was later, that our public library websites were not accessible. I was shocked. I think most people were because they pride themselves on their website. And you were kind enough to provide us with the information we needed to make the changes. Each library system got data on what was wrong with their database or with their website. And they also got some training through the library for blind and physically handicapped on how to go about making the changes they need to make. I'm not ready to give a final report. That's something I need to catch up on and see where people are.
But she's being shy though. She's leading the effort, making a big change in that, and so change is on the way when it comes to public library websites.
I have a question. We talked a lot about disabilities, people with print disabilities. What about for people with cognitive disabilities? I'd be interested to hear what libraries are doing in terms of meeting the needs of those individuals.
Okay. Well, one of the more interesting things is that very often cognitive disability in some category tends to be left out of the discussion when it comes to interface design and technology. In other categories, though, it's actually kind of well dealt with. So if you're talking about cognitive impairments related to, for instance, reading disabilities, dyslexia, things like that, those actually, you have a lot of work done, not only through LVPH, but there are various programs, reading programs and things like that, and that can be done in your local public library. I think, in my mind, the split is between, let's say, areas of, we'll say, however you want to define it, intellectual disability, cognitive impairment, whatever term you want to use, ones which there's been tons of research and we really know what to do, for instance, related to the types of services that LVPH provides, and other ones where there's a lot less known from a research point of view. So, for instance, how people with Down syndrome or people with autism, so there's a little bit less, I've often made that argument in terms of the technology research. We've got about 30 to 35 years of research on blind people in technology, deaf people in technology. There are all these groups that we really know what we're doing, and then there's some other groups like people with autism, people with Down syndrome, where we're just sort of figuring out, okay, we've started looking now, as a research community, I don't mean my group, I mean as an international community, about how they interact with technology and devices and read. So I think that's kind of the split I would see between the ones like dyslexia where we really know what we're doing and those are well served by the types of service that LBPH provides. Is there more that public libraries could do? Absolutely. But that would be sort of the package of learning more about how to provide services to diverse users in this context, but there are others that we know much less about. And again, we have a whole sort of research line that my group does about people with Down syndrome and interaction with technology. And we're just breaking all these assumptions because people assume without collecting data. And I see Jill has something that she wants to add about that. Jill.
Yeah, I think that the growing number of patrons we've had at LBPH were children with learning disabilities and cognitive disabilities. And I think, and don't let this out of this room, a lot of the LBPH libraries took the NLS guidelines broadly. We do include children with autism. We really did include a lot of children with multiple disabilities because we found that the same programs for children that apply to children who are blind or who are part of the eligibility category for LBPH still could be made inclusive for children with autism or other disabilities. So that I think is changing. You know, the inclusiveness means something different than it did a few years ago. There's something I want to add
Go for it.
about, this is just about the question that came in on Twitter and the one about the library above the liquor store. Just as part of the Montgomery County Library Board, I was just amazed at what, I can't stress enough, what advocacy can do, because we started a community effort a few years ago, and we started it slowly, and then we got, and there's somebody else here who could speak to this, we got bigger and bigger and bigger, and by the time we came to testify about our libraries before the council, one of the council members said, okay, we know, don't mess with libraries. So I really, really believe in, yeah.
How are we doing time-wise? Timekeepers?
Yeah, we should probably stop now.
Okay, we're
Sorry.
trying. We know you have to leave, so.
Yeah, our 10:45 speaker is not here yet, so I've been promised she is going to be here soon, so why don't we take like a 5 or 10 minute break so you can get up and perhaps talk about accessibility.
And a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.